LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Jim Holt, who joins us to discuss his book, Why Does the World Exist? Why is there a world rather than nothing at all remains the most curious and enduring of all metaphysical mysteries. Moving beyond the narrower paths of Christopher Hitchens, Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking, Holt enters the fascinating debate with a broad, lively and deeply informed narrative that traces all our efforts to grasp the origins of the universe. With sly humour and a highly original personal approach, Holt takes on the role of cosmological detective, suggesting that we have been too narrow in limiting our suspects to God and the Big Bang. He tracks down, among others, an eccentric Oxford philosopher, a Nobel Laureate physicist, a French Buddhist monk, and author John Updike just before he died, to pursue this cosmic puzzle from every angle. As he pieces together a solution while offering useful insights into time, consciousness and eternity, he sheds fascinating new light on the meaning of existence. Hello and welcome, Jim Holt, and thank you very much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Very glad to be here.
Now, Jim, today we're going to talk about your book, Why Does the World Exist? Which basically is the three big questions that we like to ask here. Basically, why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? All rolled into one. And before we dive into it, perhaps tell us how you came to this question, because in the first part of the book, entitled Confronting the Mystery, you talk a little bit about your life and how your journey brought you to this question.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the state of Virginia and in a very religious household. And I was taught by nuns, and I was tutored by Franciscan monks, and they taught me about Thomas Aquinas, and they taught me basically the same thing that all Americans grow up being told, that the world exists because God created it out of nothing. And if you ask why God exists, well, God is in the business of existing. Existence is part of his essence. He's perfect. He's self-creating, or something along those lines. So anyway, that's a story that I imbibed as a youngster. And when I reached adolescence and got a little rebellious intellectually and in other ways, I started having doubts about this. And I was sort of pretentious and precocious as a teenager, and I went to the local university library and checked out some books by people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger on existentialism, and when I was reading Heidegger's book, An Introduction to Metaphysics, the very first words of that are why is there something rather than nothing? And when the question was put before me in such a stark, poetic form, it really galvanized me. And I've been interested in it all my life, and I went on to study mathematics and physics, but I was always interested in philosophy, and I was interested in religion. I read Kierkegaard in college, as most people do, and so forth. So the question that's always haunted me, was always sort of playing about in the suburbs of my mind. And then I eventually thought this is an awfully good idea for a book, because not only does it touch on every what I consider to be every intellectually thrilling subject, like the nature of space and time and eternity and causation and laws of nature and God and proofs for the existence of God and string theory and the whole everything. But no one had ever done it before. I mean, so it was wide open. I could go out there, make a fool of myself, and I could meet a lot of great thinkers and talk to them and get them to think out loud and see what the results were. So then that's how I started writing the book. And then, as it happens, while I was writing it, the question, why is there something rather than nothing, very unexpectedly became a kind of a hot button issue in American politics and culture. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe you'd like to interject a question here.
Well, no, simply just to reflect on the fact that this is an eternal question. It's always been, as far as we can tell, with humans, and it's always there in our lives, everywhere we go, every area of life or culture or society. We may not be obvious, but it is there, and it sort of haunts us. And yet, so many people don't feel moved to ask it at all.
You know, the philosopher Schopenhauer said that the lower a man is in intellect, the less mystified he is by existence. And so, the idea is that if you've never thought about this, you might be intellectually deficient. I wouldn't go that far, but I think as I point out in the book, this existential, this cosmological question, why does the universe exist? Why does the world exist? Sort of rhymes with a more personal question: why do I exist? The world easily could have gotten along without me. It's sheer luck that my parents arranged their sexual congress in a precise way so that the sperm that was carrying one half of my genetic identity managed to swim its way gaudily to the egg and create the unique genetic identity that has become me. So yeah, I mean it's mysterious on many levels. But just getting back to the point I raised earlier about the issue suddenly bursting forth on talk radio and cable TV in the United States. This happened with the so-called, what we call here the God Wars, which began when some neo-atheist thinkers like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and others wrote anti-religion books that all became bestsellers. And when Christopher Hitchens, who's probably known to your audience, I hope so at least, he's now dead, but when he would appear on cable TV talk shows arguing with right-wing defenders of religion, they would say, well, look, Christopher, you can, if you don't accept there's a God, how can you explain why there's a universe at all? It defies logic that all of this came out of nothing. And the neo-atheists, once you dispense with the God hypothesis for explaining existence, you're not really left with a lot. And so they didn't have a good response. I remember one defender of religious orthodoxy and right-wing pundit saying to Hitchens, what happened before the Big Bang? And Christopher said, I'd love to know what happened before the Big Bang. So it surprisingly became a question, seemingly the most abstract, the most pure, the most fundamental of all questions, but it was suddenly fraught with cultural significance while I was writing the book. So I knew that there were physicists who were trying to answer the question of why the world exists, why there's something rather than nothing, by purely scientific means. And I thought, okay, so in addition to the God hypothesis, there's the possibility that the laws of quantum field theory will explain how a universe burst into existence out of nothingness, and that's interesting. But maybe there are other possibilities out there. Maybe we've been too narrow in limiting the ontological suspects to God versus the laws of physics. And then I was watching TV. This was about 10 years ago. I was watching a show, and Martin Amis was the guest, and the host of the show, who knew Amos was very interested in these cosmological questions too, said, Martin, why do you think, where do you think the universe came from? And Amos said, well, I'd say we're about 5 Einsteins away from answering that question. And I thought, 5 Einsteins, sounds about right. So maybe I can go out and find some of those Einsteins. Maybe they're around, and sort of, arrange them in the right order and see if I can make some progress in exploring this issue. So that was what I set out to do in the book.
Well, I think that a lot of people don't ask this ultimate question because they're afraid that it might reveal, even if they don't have an answer, but they can form sort of pseudo-answers in their own mind. If it revealed that the universe and creation and the earth had no purpose, that would be quite traumatic. I think that's why a lot of people have religion. They maybe don't deeply feel it and believe it, but it gives them some comfort that all of this has a point. But equally, the other side of it is that if it was revealed to us through science or other means that there was a purpose to creation and existence, that would be traumatic for perhaps some hardline materialists. They might be forced to ask themselves some questions and ponder meaning if there was purpose to this after all.
Yeah, I mean, the conclusion I came to at the end of the book is the conclusion that most people, I believe, in the secular age have come to, is that there is no cosmic purpose. And so, how do I react to that emotionally? I find it quite liberating. I mean, supposing that the reality, the most general form that we should expect reality to take is that of an infinite, mediocre, incomplete mess, a kind of cosmic junk shot. And so bits of it's a mixture of mathematical elegance and inelegance. It's a mixture of good and evil. It's a mixture of beauty and ugliness. It's infinitely far removed from nothingness, but it falls infinitely short of realizing every possibility. And it's parts of it looks at times it looks as though it has a sort of purpose built into it, but then at times it looks as though it has a rather the contradictory purpose built into it, and then at times it looks absolutely absurd. So I think the conclusion is that this is liberating. I mean, suppose we were living in the world that Leibniz, philosophizing as a Christian, thought we were living. It's the best of all possible worlds, and that's why God picked it out from all of the other logical possibilities when he was creating the world. So that would be, I mean, I think I would find that very onerous, because it would mean, so why was I brought into existence in this world? Well, if it's the best of all possible worlds and that's its purpose, then my role is to make it as good as possible. And who wants to be charged with that assignment? I mean, that's it's a pretty terrible obligation. So I think that the apparent purposelessness of existence is, we should take that as a sort of liberating epiphany, because it means that we don't have this cosmic purpose imposed on us. We're free to invent our own purposes. I think one of the most profound things in all of literature is in the Russian novel Oblomov, where the title character is told the purpose of life is to live. And there's a certain sort of beauty to that, I think. And it's interesting that one of the people that in the book that I talk about is Woody Allen, the American filmmaker and former stand-up comic, and he, of course, takes a very dim view of the universe and existence. He thinks it's a brutal, meaningless place of suffering. We all go to our graves in a meaningless way and so forth. But it has little pockets of beauty and charm, and I sort of think that's enough. So. I don't want to have a cosmic purpose imposed on me, and I like to think that at the conclusion of this long quest, I have reaffirmed the secular belief that there is no purpose.
Oh, well, everyone might as well just go and get coffee now then, really, because that's
which is nice, or pour yourself a glass of whiskey, or write a sonnet or a sestina, or look for the mathematically complete form of string theory. It's all good. If evil is your thing, go out and do some evil. No, I shouldn't say that.
And yet we do seem to have this tendency towards, this may be a matter of belief for some people, but I seem to see in the world a tendency towards goodness, towards empathy. I mean, what would explain that?
There are reasons for believing that there's an arc of moral progress in the universe. When you get for instance, the observable universe came into existence about 13.7 billion years ago in the Big Bang, and then all that time elapsed, and eventually you get these self-replicating chemicals, and then you get proto life forms, bacteria, and so forth, and eventually you get interesting life forms, and you get life forms that have consciousness and have higher cognitive powers like us. And so, at first, this Darwinian struggle by which life and more complicated forms of life emerge is a brutal one. It's nasty. It involves, nature is red in tooth and claw, as someone put it. But then eventually, you have to have a strategy for dealing with these other, self-replicating, complicated beings. And the best strategy is in game theory, it's called tit for tat. Basically you cooperate with other people, with other beings, until they give you a reason not to cooperate. I mean, the basic idea is, if you won't hit me, I won't hit you. And so that's the first sort of glimmering of a kind of goodness in the universe. And then the other glimmering is that if I look at a child of mine, that child is just a bag of self-replicating chemicals like me, but half of that child's genes are the same as my genes, and the other half is the child's mother. And so if I see my child drowning, I have this sort of evolutionary built-in motive to save the child, not because the psychological reason is love, but I also happen to share half my genes with it. So this is a sort of a way that a kind of concern for others in a very primitive can emerge from brute matter. And so as the universe develops more and more complicated forms of organization and consciousness and self-replication, you do see a sort of arc of goodness. And we're at a very early stage of the universe, and it could be at the so-called omega point, very late into the universe. This arc of goodness and moral progress culminates in along with sort of great cognitive power in almost a sort of godlike entity. I mean, this is the speculation of some physicists and some religious thinkers like the French Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin and so forth. And I think it's a little bit, it's slightly woolly, but fun to entertain at times. So I think in a sense there's reason for optimism, but it's a bootstrapping sort of thing. It's not a cosmic goodness that's imposed from above, as it were. It's something that sort of gets going as we climb out of the muck and start organizing societies and start using our intelligence for good purposes and so forth. And so, that's kind of heartening in a cosmic way.
Well, one thing the book makes clear is you're talking to people of a religious bent and talking to scientists and people who somewhat straddle both camps, that they historically have offered us, their versions of the truth. Science is obviously the one that's more in vogue, or has been certainly, since Newton's day, as it were, materialistic, reductionistic science. But they're starting to sort of overlap and converge in a way that people have argued they actually did thousands of years ago. And it's clear that both avenues of exploration and attempts to gain knowledge are offering us pieces of a puzzle. And it's clear in the book that we're not going to get to the bottom of this, if we ever do, with pure science.
One of the things that science is not good at explaining is the place of mind and consciousness in the universe, the phenomenon of subjectivity. I mean, a scientist can know everything there is to know, for instance, about how the brain works and how all about optical theory and the nature of photons and wavelengths of light and so forth. But if that scientist is blind, she won't know what it's like to see something, to see red, to see a red rose. There's sort of ineffably subjective aspects of our experience, the way peppermint tastes, the way it feels to get pinched, the way it feels to lose a loved one, and since these are all sort of qualitative phenomena, science, which is a quantitative structural enterprise, can't explain them. You can't capture subjectivity in quantum field theory. So there's a big part of the world of reality that science leaves out, and deliberately, because science, being quantitative, it can't capture qualitative things like the subjective feel of things. But for us, that's all important. If there was nothing, if there were nothing but elementary particles sort of bumping around and coming into various formations, there would be no value in the world. So if you think of Adolf Hitler, he's just a bunch of elementary particles, and think of Auschwitz. I mean, it can all be described by physics. But if you describe that by physics as just a big swarm of elementary particles bumping around and coming into different formations, you leave out one of the fundamental aspects of reality is the evil of it and the suffering of it. So, and I'm hardly the only one to point out that, science gives us a very incomplete picture of existence. And we don't really, and the more scientific progress we make, the more the very nature of the material world becomes elusive. In the 19th century, the material world was thought of as, sort of made up of little, billiard ball-like things, good solid entities that sort of bumped around and influenced each other by pushing and pulling. And now in the 20th century, in the 21st century, we know that's a ridiculously naive vision of the physical world. It's actually, far more ghostly. If you look at matter on the smallest levels, the atom and the subatomic level, any kind of materiality, any sort of determinate particle sort of dissolves into into pure mathematics, into a play of mathematical fields. And so, what is the this has been called the dematerialization of nature, and it actually began as far back as Isaac Newton, when Newton talked about gravity as a force that the sun exerts upon the earth, but it sort of moves through intervening space without any material mechanism. It doesn't actually sort of reach out and pull the earth towards it. It exerts this sort of ghostly influence, and Newton couldn't explain the nature of that. And it just got worse and worse in the 20th century when we discovered how weird the quantum world was, that it was more like a thought than billiard balls. And so all of this is to say that our grasp of what being is, of what reality is, even the part of reality that science deals with, is very incomplete now. I mean, for me to ask the question, why does the world exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? There's an arrogant naivete to that, because we don't even know what the world is in any interesting sense. I mean, if you ask a quantum physicist, what does reality consist of? Well, he'd say it's this object called the universe, which I'll abbreviate U, and you can't talk about it consisting of individual objects and properties. It's just this one big holistic thing, and its state is described by a vector that's rotating in an infinite dimensional Hilbert space. And so for the quantum physicists, there are no such things as tables and chairs and rocks and people and so forth. It's just this single entity that's described by a very sort of complicated law of motion. How naive is that going to look 500 years from now, when we'll have a much more sophisticated understanding of reality? So yeah, we don't understand how mind fits in. We don't understand the nature of mathematical entities, which mathematicians believe are sort of timeless and eternal and perfect, like Plato's ideas. Are they part of the physical world? And we don't even have a really good understanding of the physical world and its essential nature itself. So, all possibilities are open for explaining this.
You put forward the very interesting idea in the book that a hacker might have been behind the creation of the universe and our reality. And there does seem to be evidence when we look around that there was you could certainly posit that there was an ultimate creative force somewhere, and there seems to be evidence for intelligence at work and design and purpose. It does appear to be everywhere if we look. But you also point out that, yes, but the hacker doesn't necessarily have to be godlike, in the sense it doesn't have to be particularly good or particularly intelligent or even have a real overriding reason for doing any of this.
If you think about, could the universe, our universe, have been created by something like an intelligence that had purposes? Yes, as you point out, it need not be a godlike entity. It could be a being that falls far short of being all-powerful and all-knowing and perfectly benevolent and so forth. But it's going to be a being, that is powerful enough and intelligent enough to create something that looks like our universe. And I was talking to a great Russian physicist who now teaches at Stanford in California, Andrei Linda, and he's the author of the theory of chaotic inflation, which is probably the best theory we have now of what was going on before the Big Bang, and it explains a lot of empirical findings that have been made in the last 15 years with the various satellites observing the shape of the background radiation left over from the Big Bang. Anyway, so Andrei Linda, this very great physicist, he points out that to create a universe, because of this inflationary mechanism at the beginning of our universe, you don't really need a whole lot of resources. You just need about 1/1,000,000th of a gram of matter, and so a sufficiently advanced civilization could create a universe. A physicist hacker could create a universe like ours in a lab, and it would begin expanding into another set of spatial and temporal dimensions and so forth. And I said to Linda, well, would this, if our universe had been created that way by a hacker physicist in another universe, how could we come to know our imperfect creator? And he said, well, that's a very interesting question, because if the creator tried to write a message across the sky, please remember that I made you, with the inflationary scenario at the beginning of the universe by which all the particles and energy are created, that message would be blown up to be so large that we would never be able to read it. We would be living in a sort of a tiny little corner of one of the letters. So the only way the hacker physicist could affect our universe and could get a message to us would be by encoding the message in the fundamental constants in the laws of nature. And so this physicist, Andre Linde, who was somewhat ironically presenting the scenario, said, and that could be the explanation for why our own universe is kind of screwed up. I mean, the laws of nature that we're discovering, at first we hoped they would be very beautiful and very elegant, but they're not that elegant. They're kind of messy, and they're full of all kinds of arbitrary numbers that don't seem to have any further explanation. And our only hope is that maybe these numbers are sort of a coded message from this imperfect intelligence who created us. And I think that this is a fun scenario to think about. I don't really take it seriously, but I do say in the book that if you look around at the universe, at the world we live in, one hypothesis, the religious hypothesis, is that it's created by a godlike entity who is 100% good and 100% powerful. But the way it actually works, my theory is that it was created by a being that's 100% malevolent but only 80% efficient. And that would pretty much explain everything.
Just a quick note on the idea of laws of physics or nature or the universe. There's also the idea around that laws don't cause events, they don't determine them, but rather they sum up what's happened. They're kind of a measure of what's going on. Rupert Sheldrake, the biologist, presents this idea that instead of these natural laws or universal laws, that they're actually more like habits and tendencies that build up over time. And indeed, he's pointed out that certain universal constants, such as the speed of light and gravity, actually fluctuate.
This is something that I know about rather than know. I'm very skeptical of. I haven't seen any hard empirical evidence that the constants like the law of like the speed of light do fluctuate. I mean, I know that there's some speculative thought along those lines. But yeah, your point about the very idea of a law of nature, the fact that we call them laws of nature suggests that these are sort of rulings that must be obeyed. The old idea is that God ordained the laws of nature, and that that the planets follow the trajectories they do because they're obeying the law of gravitation. But in fact, that's sort of a pre-modern understanding of law that we still haven't shaken off because we haven't found a better understanding of the laws of nature. Philosophers of science argue endlessly about this, and they'll tell you that we don't really know what a law of nature is, and we don't understand cause and effect. David Hume in the 18th century showed that our intuitive notion of cause and effect isn't really valid. There's no, we see kind of necessity out there in the world, but the necessity that we see is projected onto the world by our minds. And so the whole idea that you can explain, some physicists have reported recently to explain how a universe could leap into existence out of nothingness. They start with, they define nothing as a closed space-time geometry of zero radius, and then they do some calculations in quantum field theory, making a few assumptions, and they say, oh, lo and behold, a little patch of false vacuum can pop out of that nothingness with a finite probability, and then it can inflate into a whole universe. And then you say, but why should a patch of false vacuum tunnel into existence out of nothingness? And you say, well, that's what the laws of quantum field theory ordain. And say, yeah, but where are those laws? I mean, are they sort of, written? Are they, you can say the mind of God, but then you've got a God back in the picture again. And how do those laws inform nothingness that it's pregnant with the universe? This is all, these are scientists talking about how a universe could have arisen from nothing at all, but their account is, it sounds like a primitive creation myth of an Amazon tribe. I didn't mean to be disrespectful to Amazon tribes in saying that, but it's not a very philosophically satisfying explanation.
Well, I wouldn't worry about offending people. That my website hits from the Amazon are showing is very, very low. Okay. But the question of, in your book, the section which came closest to giving me a brain hemorrhage was actually the one entitled A Brief History of Nothing, where you're trying to ponder the nature of nothing, what that could be. I mean, listen to what I'm saying, how nothing could be something. and also the question that you've just been addressing of getting something from nothing in terms of creation. And when I was a kid and I used to ponder nothing, the image that came in my mind was an empty vessel, but then there's still a vessel.
Yeah, that's a problem. The very argument that you came up with as a kid, or the very sort of thought experiment, you try to imagine nothing and you empty out the vessel, but there's still the vessel, and that seems to be something. That very argument was the subject of a book-length monograph by an Oxford philosopher who died about 4 or 5 years ago, named Bede Rundle. It's Bede Rundle. He wrote a book with the title "Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing," and his argument was that nothing was impossible. If you try to imagine nothing, you sort of empty out the universe, but you're still left with a kind of vessel or a stage or an arena. It's just empty, but it's still something. And I think this is it's a terrible argument. If we can't imagine something, from our failure to imagine something, we can't conclude that something is impossible. I mean, there are lots of things. The general relativity tells us that we live in a four-dimensional space-time that has curvature, and we can't. This is something we can't imagine curved four-dimensional space-time, but it would be foolish to deny that it exists based on our failure to imagine it. So yeah, it may be impossible to imagine. Another experiment was the French philosopher in the early 20th century, Henri Bergson, who said, if I try to imagine nothing, I can empty out my consciousness, but I'm still left with myself, my own consciousness. I'm still the observer, observing nothings. And this is another bad argument. The German poet Goethe found it impossible to imagine his own non-existence, and so he thought, oh, that must mean that I'm immortal. And I know that sounds foolish, but Goethe actually concluded that it's the worst argument for your own immortality possible. But it's funny that nothingness is so hard to imagine, but on the other hand, people feel that nothingness is the most sort of simple and natural form that reality could take. So they're surprised that there's something rather than nothing. So it's a paradox that nothing seems sort of unreachable, unimaginable, and maybe even impossible on the one hand. But on the other hand, people think that it's so simple and natural that it should have prevailed over something. That it's surprising there's a world rather than nothing at all. So make of that what you will. But once you start playing games with nothingness, you can have a whole lot of very innocent intellectual fun, and I do a certain amount of that in the book. I think Lewis Carroll did it somewhat better in Alice in Wonderland.
Well, there's no shame to come second there. If we take the idea then that there's always been something, then you sort of ask, well, could anything always have been? And then, because the question always keeps coming up, okay, well, what's behind that? What's before that? And it's the idea of the eternal regress that keeps coming up in your book. And, the question of, okay, infinity, how does infinity begin? I mean, do you know what I mean? It's always this idea, because of the world we live in, that things start and they stop and they come and they go. They're not always there. And if the world is actually eternal, you put the question, well, does the mystery then of existence lessen, or does it even go away?
Yeah, it's funny that it's very easy for us to imagine time going on forever into the future, but hard to imagine that time extends infinitely far into the past. And so for instance, supposing take the number pi in mathematics. The number pi, as we know, has an infinite number of digits. So you could start, and they never repeat, and they never terminate. So I could start reciting the digits of pi right now: 3.141592653589793, etc. And if I were immortal, I could recite them for all eternity into the future. Now, the philosopher Wittgenstein, in one of his lectures, he imagined walking down the road and coming across a man sitting by the road, and the man is saying 951413 finished, and Wittgenstein says, Finished what? What were you doing? He said, well, I've been reciting the digits of pi backwards from infinitely far to the past, and I just got to the end. I mean, you think about, I don't know if that's probably too difficult to be conveyed in this kind of interview, but if you think about that, it's really kind of puzzling. Yes, and we can, each of us can imagine, perhaps our own immortality. We can imagine going on forever. We don't think we will. We think we're all destined for the grave. But you can imagine sort of, never dying. But yet there was this sort of long period before you existed, and then suddenly, you wake up to consciousness after this, long period where you didn't exist. It's sort of impossible to imagine going infinitely far back in the past. But anyway, so maybe the universe itself is eternal, unlike us, and maybe you can always explain the state of the universe at any given moment by the state it was in at the previous moment, and in a sense you would have a complete explanation for the universe, but the explanation would be internal to the universe. You couldn't explain why it's that series of states of the universe rather than some completely different series. So another way of thinking of this is, suppose you have a book, like the Bhagavad Gita, and you say, why does this book exist? And you say, well, actually a scribe copied it from an earlier copy of the book. Well, why did that copy exist? Well, another scribe copied that from still earlier, and on back into the infinite past. So you would have an explanation for each copy of the Bhagavad Gita. But why the Bhagavad Gita to begin with? Why not Das Kapital by Marx? So even if the world were eternal, there would still be a mystery as to why it took that form rather than any of the infinitely many other logically possible forms.
Yes, and you touch upon, again in the book, the question of how deep you can go with any explanation. And then it gets very interesting because you sort of ask the question about the nature of what an explanation in itself actually is.
Yeah, well, I mean, the one idea is that explanation goes on forever, and that the children are very good at exploiting this because, they say, "Daddy, why is the sky blue?" And you can say, "Well, because the oxygen molecules scatter photons in that region of the spectrum." And say, "Well, why do oxygen molecules do that?" And why? The child can go on forever, and never terminate the series of why questions. That's why, by the way, it was once said, if you take the question, why is there something rather than nothing, the most fundamental of all questions, it would only occur to a child or a metaphysician. I'm not sure that's true, but anyway, so yeah, so there's this idea that explanation can never come to an end because if you had what seemed to be the final explanation, you can always ask, well, why does it take that form and not some other form? Now, in the book, I actually think decide towards the end, and this, by the way, this is not me thinking. I'm just a journalist. I'm just a conduit for the ideas of serious thinkers. And so one of the thinkers I encountered very late in the book is the great Oxford philosopher Derek Parfit, and he I found to be the most enlightening thinker on the question on these sorts of ultimate questions. And using his way of thinking about the mystery of existence, I concluded that eventually you do run out of logical possibilities for explanation if you push the attempt to explain all of existence hard enough. You do come to a sort of a logical point where there is something like a unique explanation. So, I mean, I think this is a controversial bit in the book, and it's the only slight glimmer of actual originality in the book, the only bit that's due to me. Everything else is, my presentation of great, the thought of great theologians and great cosmologists and physicists and great philosophers and even a great novelist, John Updike, who pondered these mysteries. And also the form, does explanation always have to be scientific type explanation based on laws and cause and effect? What about more general forms of explanation, like Aristotle's idea that we can explain things teleologically? We can explain things by an end that they might be striving towards. I mean, this sounds like primitive thinking, but in fact, teleological thinking is back in fashion in physics to some extent. And it may be that 500 years from now, people will look back and say, oh, those poor people in the 21st century, they were using this almost medieval scheme of explanation where they only relied on cause and effect. And we know, that's such a limited way of thinking. So yeah, I think we should always, realize that our explanatory resources, are actually very primitive and try to find sort of richer ways of explaining things, which are necessary when you're trying to explain all of existence.
There's also an area that interests me greatly that you get into, which is quite an in vogue idea, certainly has been for the last probably 10, 15 years, particularly since pop culture events like the Matrix films, and that's the idea of the universe as a field of information, and that then brings in the idea that a lot of people like the idea of universe as computer simulation.
Yeah, that's a real threat actually, because I mean, if you suppose that there are other intelligent civilizations out there that for one reason or another we have not made contact with, some of them will be technologically far more advanced than ours, and they will have discovered the Turing machine and the computer, and they'll be doing and then vastly more powerful computers and quantum computers and whatever comes after quantum computers. They'll be doing this amazing virtuoso information processing. And so as soon as you get your hands on a computer, that one of the most fun things to do is to do a little simulation. Create your own little artificial world according to very simple rules. You might you could simulate a traffic patterns, or you can simulate a weather system, or you can simulate a human mind as a set of input-output relations, but stimuli come in and then there are behavioral outputs, and you sort of process the information to get from one to the other. And if you did a really complicated simulation, you might come up with one that was good enough, a little computer that could, if I had a terrible, if I were in a terrible auto accident, my brain was screwed up. You could put in some silicon bits, some bits of a computer, and they would do the same things that my bits of my brain were doing. So maybe you could simulate even consciousness. And so then this create the possibility. Could a very advanced civilization come up with a very complicated computer simulation that would simulate something like the world we live in, with very complicated information processors like ourselves who are conscious and so forth? And if that happened, would the beings inside, would there actually be consciousness within the simulation? And would and could the beings inside the simulation ever be aware that they were part of the simulation? But then you think, if there are lots of civilizations doing this, there are probably many more simulations than there are actual physical realizations of intelligent societies. So it's much more likely that we're a simulation rather than something that arose directly from brute matter. I've never seen the Matrix, but I gather that this there's something along the lines of that. And then if you think about, going back to what is material reality, and basically physics describes fields, that reality is a play of fields, which are basically, mathematical, they're information states. And so it may be that there's no more to reality than just a play of information. So reality would be, by this way of thinking, it would be like a computer simulation, but there's no actual hardware. There's only software. There's the program running, but it's not running on anything. And so an Australian philosopher, a friend of mine named David Chalmers, who takes this rather seriously, said that it actually can explain both mind and matter, that physics is information from the outside, as it were, and mind is information from the inside. So you think of all of being, which consists of mind and matter, it's all made up of this neutral stuff called information. And that again is, I consider that wildly speculative, but it's a really interesting sort of speculation, and it's sort of pleasurable to contemplate radical scenarios like that.
Yes, well, there's speculation that has a sort of if not a ring of truth about it, then at least something that you feel that is worth exploring, as opposed to things which don't really speak in that way. They just seems to be sort of logical dead ends. Alongside the idea of the God hypothesis of a good, loving God with a purpose for us all and creation in general, I really like the idea they introduce, basically God creating the universe because he's suffering from a sort of form of spiritual fatigue, or he's basically bored. And this ties in nicely with an idea that I read about a few years ago, and it was very profound. It really moved me, just the concept of it, and it was the idea that all there is a singular consciousness, which is, in the best case scenario, is playing hide and seek with itself in all these objects we see in creation and reality. It's like a game, it's a playground. And the worst case scenario is that this singular consciousness is suffering from such terrible loneliness, because it's all there ever has been or ever will be, that again, it's hiding from itself in all this multiplicity of forms.
Yeah, that's actually a a more profound idea than anything that's in my book. Very good. Yeah, I mean the idea that even if this sort of divine infinite mind can conjure into existence an entire world, in a sense the world lives inside the mind. I mean this is sort of an idea that goes back to Spinoza, right? But basically the entities in the world they're phantoms. I mean it's like if I were psychotic and I had a sort of a delusional world full of phantoms. I mean that's not really a good world to live in because those things aren't real. By the way, the idea of this whole idea of God creating the world out of sort of spiritual ennui was presented to me by John Updike, the great American novelist who died a few years ago. Died actually about a year after I interviewed him, and it was only after I had talked to all of the physicists and the theologians and the philosophers and so forth that I thought to speak to Updike, and he gave it was a sort of a lovely literary fillip to the whole debate, and he conjured up an image of God, sort of alone, and he thought of the universe, our universe, many cosmic eons into the future, when all of the particles have spread out so far so they can't interact with each other, and entropy or disorder is at a maximum, and all of the black holes have burned out, and it's the closest maybe we can imagine to nothingness. And now imagine God, surrounded by this ontological wasteland, and just out of sheer boredom, conjuring a new and organized and beautiful world into existence. Almost, as Updike said, like a bit of light verse, as a sort of divine amusement. And I just thought it was, a very, very pretty image, and it made me feel rather good about existence. I mean, we're not living in the morally best of all possible worlds, but it's like a really good bit of light verse. Don't take it too seriously, but it's still sort of amusing and charming. And by the way, I think there's an interesting question. If you believe in God, and I try to be, even though I myself am an atheist, I took the religious point of view very seriously and respectfully in the book. But if you do believe in God, and the best defender of the God hypothesis that I talked to was the Oxford theologian Richard Swinburne, who's absolutely brilliant and knows as much about physics as he does about theology, which is a lot. And he refused to say that God's existence was necessary. That's the old argument you get from medieval philosophers, that God exists by his very definition. This is built into the, St. Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. But he didn't believe that, and he thinks all of those arguments to the conclusion that God exists by logic alone are fallacious. So I said, well, that would mean, Professor Swinburne, that God himself is a sort of, if God exists, as you think he does, is a sort of brute fact, and there's no further reason for his existence. He says, yes, that's true. And it occurred to me that, it's possible that even the eternal God could be puzzled by his existence. I mean, an eternal God could imagine the possibility of nothingness, and he might think, why is there me rather than nothing? And I love the idea of God being puzzled by his own existence. I hope that doesn't sound irreverent, but and then maybe bringing a finite temporal world into existence to distract himself from his own puzzlement at his own existence.
Yes, well, I don't think it's being irreverent, because if God is how most religions tell us he is, then he wouldn't mind that at all. He'd understand why we're asking these questions. I don't believe in God per se, but I also don't feel that I actually know enough to be a committed atheist just yet. I don't think the results are in.
If you're astonished and awed by existence itself, a good example of it, Wittgenstein, who I think was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, had a very profound sort of spiritual element to his temperament, and he was greatly astonished by the miracle of existence. He said, the mystical is not how the world is; it's that the world exists at all, and how astonishing that there should be anything rather than nothing. And it may be that this is the deepest impulse behind religion, behind behind a spiritual inclination. And there's some people who just don't have it. I mean, one of the earliest people I spoke to was in writing the book was in investigating this mystery was Adolf Grünbaum, who's a very great German-American philosopher at the University of Pittsburgh. And he was utterly unastonished by existence. He didn't see anything. He was unastonished by consciousness. He didn't see anything surprising about it. What could be more natural than that things exist? And I said, well, what about Wittgenstein? He said, oh, Wittgenstein was practically a psychotic thinker. He had no respect at all for Wittgenstein. And he thought that the only reason we find existence astonishing is because we were, as children, we were taught that God created the world out of nothing. And then, once you have God plus nothing equals the world. And if you stop believing in God, you have something plus nothing, blank plus nothing equals the world. And that's astonishing. We have, how can we even fill in that blank? But Grünbaum says, oh, you're just a prisoner of old Judeo-Christian ways of thinking. Give it up. But to me, in many moods, existence is deeply puzzling and miraculous, and my presence as part of it is even more miraculous. And so some people, maybe it's, we'll discover that, some people have a gene for being astonished by existence and others don't. I don't know.
Well, I think whether you're astonished by existence or not, I think that when you look at what exists, it's amazing. And I think if you believe that God created it in 7 days or some version of that, that's an amazing hypothesis. But I think what's even more amazing is the idea that it would arise from a primordial soup in some mud for no purpose, no reason, and completely by accident. I mean, I'm not saying that makes it incredible in terms of not believable, but that in itself would be an amazing occurrence, an amazing chain of events if it happened like that.
You can trace a series of accidents way back to the Big Bang, and then earlier you can think of a mechanism that generated lots of Big Bangs, and and this whole cosmic ensemble consisting of maybe infinitely many universes that have been growing all the way back into eternity, and maybe the whole thing sprang out of, something very, very close to nothing, and it didn't have to, according to quantum field theory. All you get are probabilities, and even, the probability could be quite low, and yet the thing happens anyway, so there's no explanation for it. But then, finally, after that, something seems to, something didn't come into existence by accident, because it's the whole framework in which these accidents are occurring, and is the fact that there is this sort of framework. It's sort of like the vessel you thought of as a child when you erase all of the atoms and stars and galaxies and animals, planets. You're left with a vessel. In science, if you look at all of the accidents, the quantum fluctuation, the Big Bang, the first self-replicating molecule arising in the primordial soup, and so forth. Yet all of this is happening within a framework of, what look like laws, and laws have some sort of necessity, we say in a very primitive way. So, it's a weird mixture of chance and necessity, which is to say, we're seeing it all through a glass darkly. We're seeing it, we're like those apes in 2001: A Space Odyssey, sort of, howling and gibbering around the obelisk, or whatever it was.
Well, ultimately, of course, it comes to the another question, which is whether we should not try and solve this ultimate question, but rather just dissolve it. And one of your interviewees specifically says that he considers this question of why there's something rather than nothing and why the world exists is basically beyond the limits of human intelligence as it stands.
People say the same thing about consciousness, right? And Colin McGinn, an English philosopher in America, has said that there is a solution to consciousness, but there's no reason our brains, which evolved according to Darwinian processes for very other purposes, to the survival and propagation of our genes, there's no reason I think our brains are capable of grasping it. So asking the question, why is there a world at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? It may sound foolish because, if there is a solution to this, if there is an answer, our pathetic, finite little brains will never be able to wrap themselves around it. and it may be a wild goose chase. There may be no answer. The question might be, nonsense. It might harbor a contradiction. But one philosopher I talked to compared this to the pre-Socratic philosophers in the 6th century BC in Asia Minor, like Heraclitus and Parmenides and so forth, asking the question, what is the world made of? And Anaxagoras and so forth. What is the world made of? Is it made of water? Is it made of air and fire? And that you might think that's a very naive question. What is the world made of? Well, why even think of looking for one kind of substance that everything is made of? But in fact, that question, which might seem very naive, it's been one of the most fruitful questions in all of science. And it's led to a tremendous amount of intellectual progress. And this question too. It might look primitive and naive and childlike, but ask it and try to push it as far as possible. And when you realize that you're trying to answer it in terms of things like cause and effect and natural law and God, and then you're pressed to make sense of those things, and you realize I don't even understand what cause and effect is. I don't understand what space and time are. I don't understand what a law of nature really is, or what this necessity is. You might have to tear down a lot of the old intellectual structure that is built up, which was sort of creaky and rotten and deserves to be torn down, and build something more solid and interesting in its place, and have a great deal of fun in the process. I mean, to me, this is just sheer. It's just intellectual. I'm sorry to say cheesecake, but that's sort of a disgusting image. But it's just it's pure pleasure. And it's cheap, everyone, you don't have to be a genius to think about these things. In fact, a lot of the geniuses I talked to almost, sounded almost as naive and silly at times as I sound when I'm, up at 3 a.m. wondering about why the world exists. So, there's a sort of democracy here. Everyone's ideas are, some claim to be, be valid, or at least to be taken seriously. And so, let's just indulge our intellectual and metaphysical curiosity and have some fun in the process.
And also, there's no reason to think that we should have all the answers now. I mean, you can look at it and say, well, human beings have been considering these big questions since forever, and we're still not that far forward. We're never going to get there. But as I say, we just don't know that, and we just seem to be living at a time of sort of particular existential angst right now. But we don't have to have all the answers today or even tomorrow.
But I felt that by the end of my quest, I certainly didn't have an answer, but I could see something sort of taking shape. It's like making out the form of something. If you're wandering around in a very thick fog, and you can sort of you're in a cathedral, you can sort of make out the form of the cathedral, but you can't really tell whether you're seeing something or you're just imagining that you are. But so by the end of the book, based on the amazing speculations of the people I talked to, and I was able to see a very general form of an explanation begin to take shape. And by the way, this explanation has specific implications for reality. I mean, one of them is that reality should be infinite, and that seems like it might almost seem like a tautology. Well, of course reality should be infinite, but actually at the beginning of the 20th century, it was thought that reality was quite finite. It consisted of the Milky Way galaxy, sort of sitting all alone by itself, and there were these little smudgy things that astronomers could see through their telescopes, and they were thought to be like clouds in the galaxy. They were called nebulae. And then with better telescopes, it turned out, lo and behold, that these nebulae were other galaxies. And then all of these galaxies contained 100 billion, on the order of 100 billion stars, like our sun. And then, there were 100 billion of these galaxies. And then this is just the observable universe. It's bigger than that. And then there's the multiverse, which may be infinite and so forth. So now it looks as though the universe is infinite. And, in one implication of the conclusion that I come to, that reality is an infinite, mediocre, incomplete mess, is that it is infinite, but it falls infinitely short of complete fullness. So it's sort of somewhere in the spectrum between nothingness and the fullest possible reality. And so that's, that actually does give you something like an empirical implication. And if reality turned to be finite, well, then, I mean, which is always possible, then this explanation would be wrong. So yeah, just because you don't have all of the T's crossed and I's dotted in your explanation doesn't mean you don't have anything of intellectual worth.
No, and I think that brings the discussion full circle quite nicely, actually. It would be a good point on which to end. Jim, I know your book's widely available. I don't know if you've got a website or if there's anything you'd like to share with listeners before we close off for today.
No, I'm afraid I have no website. I'm terribly embarrassed when people promote their books, and I've always vowed not to do that myself. So I will say that the book is reviewed in the current issue of the London Review of Books, which even though it came out it came out almost a year ago in the UK, but so there's a review in the London Review of Books, which I think is behind a paywall, so you have to be a subscriber to read it. I hope it's a good review. I only read half of it when you called up and we began the interview. So yeah, but anyway, you can still find the book on Amazon UK and all of that. But I probably, after listening to me gas on about it for an hour, I think anybody hearing this would probably be thoroughly deterred from buying the book. So
well, they shouldn't be. The book, once again, is called "Why Does the World Exist?" and it really is. It's quite a romp, to be honest. It's not scientific, overly scientific or sterile at all. I'd thoroughly recommend it to listeners. Even if you don't want to, I will.
Okay, well, thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much, Jim Holt, for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
I had a great time.
Well, that's it for another week. As always, I very much hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, I'd urge you to check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, and there you'll find an archive of programmes on many equally fascinating topics. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.